All right, so we're talking about ethnicity and who came in first as Catholics here on the American continent. So the French, they were predominantly Catholic. We've talked a little bit about the French Huguenots, the Reformed French, who got absorbed by the Dutch. Most French speakers here on the American continent were Catholic because France is a Catholic nation. And they'd mostly be concentrated where? Just a couple places that would matter for the United States. Where would you find French people? After it expands, of course, like St. Louis, But before that, where would you find French people? Or French-speaking people? Yeah.
In New Orleans?
Yeah, and the entire area of Louisiana, right? Because those are the Acadians. They got moved out of Acadia and became Cajuns. And then where else? If you were to go due north of here, what would you run into? Montreal, and that's part of?
Canada.
Yeah. Now narrow it a little bit more. Part of the province of, Quebec. And Quebec is the French-speaking part of Canada. There's other parts, there's French speakers in other parts. And along the border with Canada, in New England, you have a lot of French speakers. There was a lot of back and forth across the border. So, for a long time, these were really it as far as, major Catholic presence. Then who comes in? Who immigrates here? Who's the first big wave of immigration as far as Catholics go to hit the shores? Yeah.
Irish.
Very good. So we have the Irish. And we're going to see the Irish have a different attitude towards things than many of the other ethnicities. And at first, it's mainly French hierarchy, bishops in charge, and then, the Irish get their own representation. Then who else comes in? Who are the other big Catholic ethnicities? Yeah.
Italians?
Yeah. Now they're going to come in down the line. Who else? Yeah.
Germans?
Germans, yep. We got a lot of Catholics represented with just these four ethnicities, but who else? There's one other really big one. Yeah.
Spanish?
That's a different part of the story because for the most part, they're coming up, they're not really. First, America takes over large Spanish-speaking territories, right? In the Mexican-American War. But then there's a lot of immigration coming up later. That's a part of the story that's going to get told a bit later on. Who else? Who else is coming through Ellis Island?
Polish?
Very good. Yes, we have Polish. And then there's like a smattering of other things. There's people from Bohemia, nowadays we call that the Czech Republic. You have Lithuanians. You have some in other areas. Portuguese were here for a long time, but they were never really that big of a population. So they didn't leave that big of a mark. So why did the Irish immigrate here? What were they looking for? What were they getting away from? Any of you have Irish heritage?
Religious persecution?
There was a lot of that, yeah. The English dominated the Irish and treated them pretty poorly. A lot of Ireland was owned by absentee landlords. Yeah. Yeah, the potato crop failed. And the potatoes were the major form of food, major starch source. And once that failed, widespread hunger. They actually had the opportunity to alleviate that, but the British deliberately decided not to ship wheat over to Ireland. They made a policy of that. And so a lot of Irish came over here, and they processed, through, gradually Ellis Island became the place that you went through, because the Americans started realizing there's a lot of people who want to come here, so we have to do it in an orderly way. The Irish have their own particular peculiarities when it comes to Catholicism. So your book talks about the immigration. Then they talk about some of the labor dynamics. It says, many of the Irish were poor and illiterate, but they spoke English. That's different than these other groups, right? If you're in Ireland, you may speak with a brogue, but you probably do speak English, so it's a little bit easier to fit in. Their competition for available work at what seemed to the indigenous Protestant working class for very low wages created a resentment that was a major spur to outbreaks of nativism. Nativism takes different forms, but what it is, when we talk about being anti-immigrant, that's nativism. And there was actually a political party that formed at the time called the Know Nothing Party. And they were called the Know Nothing Party because, when you do something wrong, suddenly nobody knows anything. Nobody knows who did it. And they were doing things like attacking immigrants, rioting, doing, that sort of stuff. And it got tied in with anti-Catholicism as well as anti-Irish. I made a mention to you, the book, How the Irish Became White, a little bit earlier. Because the Irish, when they first came in, were not considered to be white by the Native Americans, who at that time didn't mean what we call Native Americans now, but meant the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants in the North primarily. They called themselves Native Americans because they had this sense that they were the ones who belonged there. So the Irish faced religious persecution not only in England, but also over here. Like the book says, one of the best opportunities for upward mobility in the Irish American community was to be a priest, to become a parish priest. Because it meant that you would get to go to school, it meant that you would have some authority. Your book talks about the vocations, encouraging vocations. Irish American Catholicism became sort of normative in America during the middle and later 19th century. And your book talks about that as having some specific traits. So the institutional church and clergy enjoyed great prestige. That's going to be different than some of these other ethnicities. Institutional church means like the hierarchy, the priests, the bishops, those people. It also talks about an ethos in which clerical celibacy, marital fecundity, and a general distrust of sexuality were prevailing emphases. So very strongly against the body, sex is only for procreation, but you should procreate an awful lot. That was a major emphasis there. And then your book talks about a devotional revolution. What are devotions? If you're devoted to somebody, what does that mean to you? What does it mean? A lot of you have boyfriends or girlfriends, right? Valentine's Day is long past, but what would you do to show your devotion? Or didn't you? I hope you did. By now we're far enough along that, if you didn't, then you probably, that's behind you. What is devotion? Or think about this, what is it in terms of religion? Does it mean just showing up at church? How can you tell the people who are really devoted from the people who are just kind of lukewarm?
They put everything they have into it, or they do extra.
Okay, that's a good way to put it. They do extra. Yeah.
Also when they're dedicated.
Yeah, devoted and dedicated, kind of two synonyms. Devotions are particular ways of doing that. So, the rosary, for example, is a Catholic devotion. Interestingly, you can see some Protestants that have started doing it, in recent years, thinking that there must be something interesting there. The Jesus Prayer for Eastern Orthodox is a devotion. Saying the Liturgy of the Hours is a pretty time-consuming devotion. There'd be a number of other examples if we were doing a comparative religion class that we could talk about with other religions. So a devotional revolution takes place. What they mean by that is the devotional life gets kind of standardized. The rosary was not originally something that everybody was doing. It was just one out of many different devotions. It became more and more popular and ended up supplanting some of the more local devotions, some of the less prevalent ones. And it was like the book says, the revolution was part of an attempt by both Rome and the Irish hierarchy to strengthen the institutional church. So that's the story of the Irish. When we look at the Germans, we see a very different story. In Ireland, everybody was pretty much one of three things. You were Catholic, you were Protestant, and you would probably be a Presbyterian because you'd be, Scots-Irish from the north, or you just weren't anything. Germany was a whole different, environment, because there you had Catholics, Lutherans, Reformed, all living side by side with each other. You also had a lot of Jews in Germany at that time, and you had free thinkers. We talked about religious liberalism, the people who were not committed to, say, Trinitarian Christianity, or who were deists. And you had outright atheists from time to time. So German Catholics already grew up in a pluralistic sort of environment that was lacking to the Irish. And the Germans economically were in a different condition as well. Like your book says, they tended not to be as near destitution as the Irish. They were able to get themselves farmland. That's why the Germans settled in the Midwest, because farmland was very cheap. And if you had just a little bit of money, you could buy yourself the tools and get yourself out there. So your book talks about the German Triangle, delineated by Milwaukee, so in the north, St. Louis in the west, and Cincinnati in the east. They tended to keep to themselves, and they preferred to continue speaking German. So as opposed to the Irish, who could assimilate once they got, past problems of, say, poverty fairly easily, the Germans tended to stay apart from the rest of American society. Why? Because they had a different language, they had a different culture. They wanted to preserve a German-speaking environment. And that stayed the same until the First World War, when we actually fought Germany. That was the main impetus to getting rid of that. Now, German-speaking Catholics, like your book points out, were worried about this issue of Americanization. How much do you adopt your ways to the new society that you're in? How much do you adopt your religion to that? Germans tended to be more conservative in that sense. And your book talks about one of them actually presenting a petition to the Pope looking for dioceses and parishes that were based on nationality rather than geography, so that everybody could keep their own ethnicity. If we look at the Polish, they're kind of in the same boat. Although the Polish are not coming from quite a pluralistic society. There's a number of different Polish enclaves, Polanias, that arise. Again, largely in the Midwest. Does anyone here know where the biggest the biggest Polish population outside of Poland is? I'll give you a hint, it's in a Midwestern city. Large enough that even in the last Polish election they set up polling booths for people who had Polish citizenship. Yeah.
Chicago.
Yeah, Chicago is a huge Polish population. And northwestern Indiana, a lot of those industrial cities have a large Polish population. They settled in some of the same places as the Germans. They wanted what your book calls parity of representation. Why was this an issue? Well, the Irish were there before, and once the Irish, had sort of supplanted the French and the English as the largest group, and had priests and bishops in place, these other ethnicities would come in, and they didn't really trust the Irish to have their best interests at heart. And they would say, we want to have our own priests, we want to have our own representatives, among bishops. And it took a while for that to happen. Like your book says, they had only token representation in the higher levels until late into the present century. And one offshoot of this was the Polish National Catholic Church. They actually split off from the main Roman Catholic Church and formed their own, very small, but still around, organization, which is, more or less along the same lines. They kept the liturgy. It's set in Polish, of course. But they wanted to have their own autonomy, you could say. And then we have the Italians, and your book talks about some really interesting things with this. Italy is divided into regions. It wasn't one unified country. And the biggest tension is between the north and the south. The south tends to be more poor, even today, more agricultural, less well developed. The north is where a lot of the centers of power were. And within the Catholic Church, this dynamic was represented. So the southern Italians were used to northerners dominating the church hierarchy. Most of the popes that were Italian were not Italian in the sense of coming from anywhere in Italy. They were from North Italy. So who was it that actually leaves for the United States? It was the poorer Italians in the south. They come here, and they've already got a well-established pattern of not trusting the hierarchy, because it doesn't seem to be coming, something that's consonant with their own needs, something that's going to draw on their experience. And they find themselves in a religious situation similar to the one that they leave behind, only instead of the North Italians, it's the Irish that control the hierarchy, that are providing the priests. And they don't feel that well represented. So it leads to this very different kind of pattern, where, like it says, there was an alienation of many Italians from the institutional church. Some defections are brought about by proselytizing, but a simple absence from the church except at rites of passage. What would rites of passage for Catholics be? Baptisms, funerals, weddings, the occasional going to confession, that sort of thing, was more the norm. And they would continue to have street festivals, but you've got this kind of split personality there. They're ethnically Catholic, but they're not going to church as often. There's a different type of devotion among these different groups. And each of these represents a different face of Catholicism in the 19th and 20th century that doesn't really gel together until later on. So now we want to look at that part of the story. How do all these come together? And that has to do with this question of Americanization. So your book talks about a few key issues. So one is called the trustee situation. What are trustees? You guys have a board of trustees here at Marist. Do you know what they do? Offhand? You're never going to see them, most likely, unless you're called upon to meet them or something. Yeah.
Don't they make decisions?
Yeah. What kind of decisions?
I don't know, the school maybe? I don't know.
For the entire school. Yeah, that's right. They make the big, decisions, which largely have to do with what would you think?
Money.
Exactly, with finances. So, how much certain groups get paid, that's something that might have to go through the Board of Trustees. And the trustees would be the ones who, in a Catholic church, would be in charge of the property. Because think about what a church comprises. You've got the actual physical building, right? People get in, on Sundays and sometimes now on Saturdays because we have vigils. And throughout the week, what do you need to maintain a building? You got to pay the rent if you don't own it. You have to pay the property tax if you do own it. You have to pay for lights, heats, upkeep, renovations, all that sort of stuff. If you're actually having sacramental wine and hosts, somebody has to buy those too. You can run down the list. There's a ton of stuff. It doesn't all come for free. It doesn't all come from donations. Some of this has to be administered, and that's what the trustees would do. And there were a lot of questions. Well, who's actually in charge of the church? Is it the priest? Is it the bishop? Is it the board of trustees? Because the trustees might be there a lot longer than any given priest. So this was something that they had to work out. And as it turned out, what they decided on was that each bishop was recognized as a corporation, sole vested property rights in the church. And so that's the structure that we actually have. And this was part of the battle, because some of the people wanted it to be lay trustees that controlled the church, rather than the hierarchy, rather than the priests and bishops. There's a lot of discussion here about schools as well. Why do Catholics want to have their own schools? Just for the uniforms? How many of you went to? Well, I won't answer because I don't want to like out anybody as a particular religion, but I imagine probably quite a few of you went to Catholic school, since you're, Marist has got a lot of Catholics. What were Catholic schools about? Why did they have these? Yeah.
They can teach their own particular beliefs without worrying about separation of church and state.
That's part of it, yeah. There was this notion that if you're going to teach faith and morals, and you think you've got that right, then why would you send your kids to other people who probably don't have it right? And, remember, they were using the King James Bible for a long time as a textbook in schools. And there was quite a lot of anti-Catholicism, so it did make some sense for them to do that. School was also a way for them to assimilate these massive waves of immigrants. We often overlook the effect that schooling has. If you have a fairly standardized school system, you can make sure that children are all brought up with the same basic ideas, the same basic information. And that's part of what the Catholic school system did. Your book then talks about, with respect to this Americanization issue, these three sort of schools of thought. And we're going to find, there's different extremes. So one extreme, we could call it the conservative. The other one, we could call it the radical. And then we're going to have something in the middle. And what do conservatives, when you put them on a scale, what do they usually want things to be like? They want things to change a lot. That's conservative kind of means, stick with the same. So one group thought that Americanization should just be rejected completely. And a lot of these were actually Germans. They thought that the faith could best be preserved together with the traditional languages and cultures of Europe. So they didn't want to, move to an English liturgy if they could avoid it. They wanted to, it wasn't an English liturgy anyway, it was Latin. But they didn't want to carry out things in English if they could avoid it. They wanted to have smaller ethnic communities, so German Catholics would remain German Catholics, Italian Catholics, so on down the line. Second group would be sort of a moderating group, and they wanted sort of let's call them the moderates. There's some distrust of Americanization. But on the question of language, they were for using English. They were for assimilating in that sense. So in their view, German Catholics should quit speaking German and become like Americans in that respect. And then the radical group, they saw Americanization as a good thing, as something that would actually enhance Catholicism here in America. So like it says, they saw the democratic ethos and policy of church-state separation not just as a tolerable option, but as a positive good. So they cooperated with other Americans in as many progressive endeavors as they could. And they actually sort of had the initiative for quite a while. They were the ones who were sort of leading the charge in Catholic intellectual life for a good long time. And then your book talks about how that changes. And it talks about a particular work called The Life of Father Hecker, where you've got this guy and he starts out as a Protestant and then he becomes a Catholic. and he becomes a redemptorist, and then he finds that that order is a little bit too old-fashioned for them, and he founds his own order, who you may have heard of, the Paulists. Their charism is to carry out the evangelization of American Protestants. So this book gets a lot of notoriety, and it finally comes to the notice of the Catholic hierarchy. And there's a reaction against this, a reaction against what they call Americanism as a heresy. And it was tied in with things like the trustee question and whether things should be decided in the church according to, democracy, whether church-state separation is an intrinsic good, all that sort of stuff. And so, originally the real dominance is on this side, but it swings over to this side by the end of the 19th century. And then you see Catholics becoming more and more, you could say, institutionally standardized. There's still differences between Irish Catholics and German Catholics and Italian Catholics and Polish Catholics, but there's this common, sort of ground of opposition to Americanization, opposition to modernism, and that doesn't change really until after Vatican II, which is where we'll take up the Catholic story once again.